Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part A. Introductory Chapters. Chapter 3. The time and purpose of the Book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic ideology. Before diving into the topic of Deuteronomistic historiography, understand why what is told, and try to understand the untold story, some basic terms need to be explained. Deuteronomium is the Greek name for the book of Deuteronomy. The meaning of this name is second law. An exact translation of the Hebrew original name of this book, Sefer Dvarim, known in Jewish tradition as Mishneh Torah, meaning the second law or the second Torah. This name reflects the book's content, which presents a second set of laws in the Pentateuch. In Deuteronomy 17, verse 18, within the law of the king, the date of the writing of the book is explicitly mentioned, with a clear allusion to the days of Josiah. I'm quoting, "And when he sits on the throne of his kingdom, he shall write for himself in a book a copy of this law, וכתב לו את משנה התורה הזאת על ספר." Whenever the book is mentioned within the book of Deuteronomy, it is always called with a direct pointing, משנה התורה הזאת, a copy of this law, or התורה הזאת, this law, or ספר התורה הזה, this book of the law. When the books of Joshua and Kings refers to the same book, it is called Sefer Habrit, the book of the covenant, or Torat Moshe, the laws of Moses, or Mishneh Torat Moshe, a copy of the law of Moses, the second Torah of Moses. Even in ancient times, the unique nature of the book of Deuteronomy stood out to all, characterized by its special language and its unique long phrases that have a tendency to repeat themselves. For example, in Hebrew, beyad chazaka ubizroa netuya, with a strong hand and an outstretched arm, or bechol levavcha ubechol nafshecha ubechol meodecha, in English, with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. The language in the book of Deuteronomy stands out in its frequent use of familiar formulas and in the many speeches embedded within the text, which explain the history and link it with obedience or disobedience to the Deuteronomic law. Deuteronomy is also characterized by its acquaintance with the history of the people of Israel and its attempt to shape and explain this history, and also by its close familiarity with the ancient set of laws that was common in Israel even before the Deuteronomic law, and its endeavor to design a new and different set of laws. All this was known, recognized, and defined since ancient times, and certainly since the beginning of critical biblical research. Given the unique nature of the book of Deuteronomy, with its characteristic ideas and language, the term Deuteronomism has formed as the accepted name for the field of research regarding the set of Deuteronomic concepts and linguistic practices, hence the terms like Deuteronomistic ideology and Deuteronomistic language. Likewise, the term Deuteronomistic history refers to the history of the people of Israel in accordance with the characteristic language and spirit of the book of Deuteronomy, especially as reflected in the set of books between Joshua and Kings. I would like to present one example, perhaps the most prominent change that Deuteronomic law seeks to shape, which is also linked to the thoughts and theories about the time of its writing. According to the law in the Pentateuch, which apparently preceded Deuteronomic law, it is permissible to erect altars in any place where God is revealed. Thus, for example, according to Exodus 20, verse 24, and I'm quoting, In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. Accordingly, in Israel and Judah, that is where all those who wanted to build altars would build them. In all the stories about altars built throughout history, they used to be built where God was revealed. Like, for example, in Mount Carmel, where, according to the story on the content between the Baal prophets and Elijah in the first book of Kings, chapter 18, I'm quoting from verses 38 and 39, the fire of God fell. And when all the people saw it, they fell on their faces and they said, Yahweh, He is God. Yahweh, He is God. Altars could be built in many other places, like in the Oaks of Mamre, near Hebron, where, according to Genesis 18, God appeared before Abraham, or Bethel, where, according to Genesis 35, verse 1, I'm quoting, God said to Jacob, Arise, go up to Bethel, and dwell there, and make there an altar to the God who appeared to you. This order is referring to the story in Genesis 28 about Jacob's dream at the site where, according to verse 16, when Jacob woke up from his dream, he realized that, and I'm quoting, surely Yahweh is in this place, and I didn't know it. Contrary to this, the book of Deuteronomy strongly asserts that the existing reality must be changed. Thus, in chapter 12, the familiarity with the reality of the day is evident, and the claim that it must be changed stand out. The new law counteracts the existing practice, which is known, and I'm quoting from verse 8 and 9, you shall not do according to all that we are doing here this day. Every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. For you have not as yet come to the rest and to the inheritance which Yahweh your God gives you. The Deuteronomy law even explicitly warns not to behave according to the old laws, and I'm quoting from verses 13 and 14. Take heed that you do not offer your burnt offerings at every place that you see, but at the place which Yahweh will choose in one of your tribes. There, maybe only there, you shall offer your burnt offerings, and there, which means only there, you shall do all that I am commanding you. End of quote. The book of Deuteronomy states that it is only permitted to build an altar to God in one place, and I'm quoting from verse 11. Then to the place which Yahweh your God will choose, המקום אשר יבחר, to make his name dwell there, only there you shall bring all that I command you. End of quote. Given this context, the debate regarding the time of writing of Deuteronomy, or at least the core of the book, and the laws it contains, is clear. To which era do the views expressed in Deuteronomy, Deuteronomic law, and the Deuteronomistic language all belong? The traditional Jewish view is known, but the difficulties associated with it already emerged in ancient times. If Moses did write the book, then how can one explain the description in Deuteronomy 34, verse 5, according to which Moses, the servant of Yahweh, died? Is it possible that Moses wrote this? And how can one explain the scripture in Deuteronomy 34, verse 10? And there has not arisen a prophet since in Israel like Moses. Is it possible that Moses wrote this? Moreover, the book of Deuteronomy opens with a definition of the place where the book itself was written. These are the words that Moses spoke to all Israel beyond the Jordan in the wilderness. Yet, the definition beyond the Jordan can only be written by someone west of the Jordan. Furthermore, in Deuteronomy 3, verse 14, and elsewhere, it is written that the things established in the days of Moses continued to this day. So, clearly, they were written in a later time when it was known that the stories originated in the distant past, in the days of Moses. Likewise, in many places, the days of Moses are described with the phrase, at the time. For example, in Deuteronomy 10, verse 8, and I'm quoting, at that time, Yahweh set apart the tribe of Levi to carry the ark of the covenant of Yahweh, to stand before Yahweh, to minister to him, and to bless in his name to this day. Even back in their days, the sages, Chazal, already debated questions about the distance of time between the events which took place and the writing of their descriptions. They noticed the problems in the text and answered in a direct and wise way within the confines of the beliefs held by traditional Judaism. Thus, in the third Talmudic tractates, in the order Nezikim, Bava Batra 15, to the question, I'm quoting, is it possible that after Moses died, he himself wrote and Moses died there? The answer given by the sages was that, I'm quoting, from this point forward, with respect to Moses' death, the Holy One, blessed be he, dictated and Moses wrote with tears. To the question, who wrote them? It means the biblical books. The answer given was that Joshua wrote his book and the eight last verses in the Torah, the eight last verses in the book of Deuteronomy. In other words, the seed of doubt as to whether the entire Pentateuch or the entire book of Deuteronomy were indeed written by Moses was already planted by the sages. So, from here on out, the question, who wrote them, should no longer be considered a question of principle, but rather one of quantity and scope, an expression of the degree of criticism towards the text. In modern biblical studies, which began over 200 years ago, the critical examination of the time in which Deuteronomy was written included the questions: were the biblical authors familiar with the book of Deuteronomy? How did they reference to it? When and in what literary context? To which historical period did the Deuteronomic law correspond, and when was it put into practice? To which period do the views reflected in the book of Deuteronomy apply? And from what date can we apply to the historiographical literature that is related in it, in its language and perceptions, to Deuteronomy? The clearest link made in the research was between Deuteronomy and the description of King Josiah cultic reform, when suddenly a book was found as described in the second book of Kings, chapter 22 and 23. In fact, Jerome and some other church fathers from as early as the 4th and 5th centuries connected the book of Deuteronomy to the book that the priest Hilkiah found in the temple during this Josiah cultic reform, and to the reform that he made. In modern research, the first to link Deuteronomy to the days of Josiah was a German theologian and biblical scholar, Wilhelm Martin Leberecht Die Wette, who wrote of this connection in his doctorate thesis submitted in 1805 at the University of Vienna in Germany, before he was appointed professor of theology at the University of Heidelberg. In his research, he emphasized the requirement within Deuteronomic law to concentrate the cult in one place. The description in the Book of Kings connecting the finding of the Book of Torah and the great fear that gripped the king because, as described in the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verse 13, for great is the wrath of Yahweh that is kindled against us, because our fathers have not obeyed the words of this book to do according to all that is written concerning us. and the cultic reform the king carried out. The latter included not only the purification of foreign cults from Judah and Jerusalem, but also the concentration of cult in Jerusalem, the place that God has chosen. So Deuteronomistic. In this spirit, the Deuteronomistic ideology both influenced and directed the entire historiographical description. And so, for example, in the Book of Kings, theological assessment formulas were written to evaluate all the kings of Israel and Judah. According to this theological assessment, all the kings of Israel did evil in the eyes of God because they all walked the way of Jeroboam, meaning they worshipped God in the temples he built in Dan and in Bethel. The destruction of the kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE was the definitive proof that Jeroboam's sins led Israel to its destruction, and this is also the earliest possible date for the development of the idea of Jerusalem being chosen and being the only permissible place of worship for the God of Israel. It is possible that this notion emerged following Sennacherib's campaign against Judah, which was conducted 20 years later in 701 BCE, and which, as will be discussed later, resulted in heavy destruction in all the territories of Judah, but during which Jerusalem itself was not conquered, having remained one of the only cities in the ancient world that were spared by the Assyrian army. According to the theological assessment formulas in the Book of Kings, some of the kings of Judah were defined as sinners, few were defined as righteous, and most of the kings were defined as neither. The standard assessment in the Book of Kings is clear and is directly connected to Deuteronomic law. Sinful kings, those who did evil in the eyes of God, are those that, according to the Book of Kings, during whose reign foreign cult prevailed in Judah. One of the most sinful kings, for example, is King Manasseh, and all his sins are listed in 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 21, verses 1 to 7, following the theological assessment formula, and I'm quoting, "And he did what was evil in the sight of Yahweh, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom Yahweh drove out before the people of Israel." The only two righteous kings, Hezekiah and Josiah, are the ones who did what was good in the eyes of God and concentrated the cult in Jerusalem, the cult for Yahweh, only in Jerusalem. Following the positive theological assessment formula of Hezekiah, starting that, I'm quoting, "And he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, according to all that David his father has done." There are clear explanations for what the king has done. First of them is a statement that he removed the high places. According to the summary of the very positive theological assessment formula in the 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 18, verses 1 to 6, he trusted in Yahweh, the God of Israel, so there was none like him among all the kings of Judah after him, nor among those who were before him. For he held fast to Yahweh. He did not depart from following him, but kept the commandments which Yahweh commanded Moses. This is a very clear and direct point to the book of Deuteronomy. The entire cultic reform is told about King Josiah, but the positive theological assessment formula states very clear, I'm quoting, "And he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh, and walked in all the way of David his father, and he did not turn aside to the right hand or to the left." 2nd Book of Kings, chapter 22, verses 1 and 2. All the other kings are said to have done what was right in the eyes of God, because from the historiographer's perspective, foreign cult was not prevalent in their days, and therefore they were not deemed sinners. On the other hand, none of these kings were aware of Deuteronomic law and the need to centralize cult in Jerusalem. the book was not found yet, and therefore they couldn't be recognized as righteous kings. For this reason, the formula provides a disclaimer in their regard, recognizing that they didn't yet know the new law in whose spirit the light, the entire biblical description was written. Thus, for example, this kind of neutral theological assessment formula is applied to King Yotam in the second book of Kings, chapter 15, verses 34-35, and I'm quoting. And he did what was right in the eyes of Yahweh according to all that his father Uzziah has done. It means there was not foreign cult in this time. Nevertheless, the high places were not removed. The people still sacrificed and burned incense on the high places. So the cult for Yahweh was everywhere in the kingdom. This description is written from the point of view of someone that knows that the cult places to Yahweh all over the kingdom have not yet been removed, and that the people continue to sacrifice and burn incense on them to Yahweh, God of Israel, because the book had not yet been found and the law had not yet been written telling them to do the cult reform. These opening formulas are just an example of the extent to which Deuteronomistic ideology dictated the historiographical descriptions of the history of Israel and Judah and used history for its own purposes in order to convey the message to the members of the generation for whom the text was intended, who understood things exactly as their ancient authors intended. Given the reality described in the Deuteronomistic historiography, the prevailing assumption among many researchers was that the time in which the book was composed and its spirit and laws were formed was between the days of Hezekiah and the days of Josiah. After all, according to the biblical description, only two kings acted according to the commandments of the book of Deuteronomy. Hezekiah, who ruled between 716 and 687 BCE, didn't act according to the written Torah, but acted according to the spirit of Deuteronomy, while in the day of Josiah, some 50-60 years later, he ruled between 641 and 609 BCE, the book was found and actions were carried out in accordance with its explicit instructions. Thus, during the days of Hezekiah, the first hints of Deuteronomistic ideology arose, and the Deuteronomistic school began to work and to formulate its ideology. While in the days of Josiah, the book found is the book of Deuteronomy, or at least the core of this book of Deuteronomy, when the ideology was already consolidated, at least in its initial form. There is no clear answer to the question of whether the kings of Judah and Josiah in particular played a role in formulating things, or whether the book was written by the priestly circles and presented to the king as if it had been found in the temple, so as to convince him to change the patterns of religion and cult in accordance with their views. However, clearly, the writers sought to carry out a cultic reform that would centralize all cult to the temple in Jerusalem, at the expense of other places of worship of the God of Israel, which were scattered throughout the kingdom. The link between the book that suddenly appeared, the new law written within it, the ideological and cultic intention of its authors, and the historical descriptions of the days of Hezekiah and especially of the days of Josiah, all dictated the main direction relevant to understanding when these laws and historiographic descriptions were written, as well as the identity of the writers and the Deuteronomistic school that stands behind all this. However, in contrast to the view presented here, a large number of researchers in the last 100 years, mainly in Central Europe, claim that the book of Deuteronomy and the Deuteronomistic ideology emerged later, dating them to the period after the destruction of the first temple to the exilic and post-exilic period. These scholars, the main claim that they have was that the account in the second book of Kings, chapter 22 and 23, regarding the finding of the book of Josiah's reform is unreliable and unhistorical, and that Deuteronomic law is utopian, which was never actually implemented during the First Temple period, while in the Persian period, the existence of the one and only temple and the concentration of cult in Jerusalem were already a fact of life. In fact, most biblical scholars, especially in Central Europe, date the existence and importance of the Deuteronomistic school to the exilic and mainly to the post-exilic period. On the other hand, in my opinion, the more logical solution is to assume that Deuteronomistic law existed from the moment of its first evidence of its existence. And from this perspective, the solution of the days of Josiah is the correct and preferable one. However, I agree that it is difficult to assume that the book of Deuteronomy, in its broad format, would be found during the days of Josiah. There is clear evidence in the book pointing to several stages of additions and additions. So it is likely that the book found in the days of Josiah was the nucleus of the book of Deuteronomy, a collection of laws framed within some sort of narrative. We can assume that even before the days of Josiah, certain circles in Jerusalem acted in favor of the formation of the new Deuteronomistic ideology, perhaps even a century earlier in the time of King Hezekiah and during the long years of reign of King Menashe. However, it is likely that even as early as the days of Josiah, scribes began working intensely with the aim of creating a comprehensive set of laws to govern the country and replace the previous laws, and the original collection was then expanded in the period after the destruction of the first temple and during the Persian period, the days of the return of some of the exiles in Babylon to Jerusalem. The connection between Deuteronomy and the days of Josiah is, in my opinion, the most important anchor point within biblical research, and is one of the points most scholars agree with and accept. There are those who see an earlier start, and there are those who see the continuation of the process later, but the connection itself lies within the heart of the consensus. The conclusion that arises from this is that the historiography, which begins in the book of Deuteronomy and ends in the days of Josiah, was written starting from this time in light of the laws, language, and ideology of the book of Deuteronomy. This is what we will discuss in the next chapter.